The rise and decline of Xerox, the Rochester lab that built the future, and watch Silicon Valley turn its inventions into an empire. On October 22, 1938, inside a converted kitchen on the second floor of 3205 37th Street in Astoria, Queens, a 32-year-old patent clerk named Chester Carlson and an unemployed physicist named Otto Kornai carried out a simple but groundbreaking experiment. They rubbed a cotton handkerchief over a sulfur-coated zinc plate, exposed a glass slide beneath a bright lamp, and sprinkled the surface with lycopodium powder. Slowly, a faint image emerged. Barely visible, the words read, October 22nd, 38, Astoria. It was the world's first xerographic image. No corporation financed it. No research institute stood behind it. From that lone image, created with improvised equipment in a rented room, would eventually emerge the copier, the laser printer, the personal computer, the graphical user interface, and the mouse. One company would go on to develop them all and then watch almost everyone slip away. You're watching the history of American electronics and technology, where we explore the companies, inventions, and engineers that shaped the modern electronic world, from the boardroom all the way down to the circuit board. If that's the kind of history you enjoy, be sure to subscribe and leave a like, because Xerox's rise is only one side of the story. The technologies it created but never truly capitalized on are the other. Chester Floyd Carlson was born in Seattle in 1906 to Swedish immigrant parents. His father suffered from tuberculosis, and by the age of 14, Carlson had become the main provider for his family. Determined to build a future for himself, he worked his way through the California Institute of Technology with a series of odd jobs, earning a physics degree in 1930, just as the Great Depression was beginning. He joined Bell Telephone Laboratories but was later laid off. Eventually, he found a position at the New York electronics company P.R. Mallory, where he handled patent work during the day while studying law at New York Law School at night. The challenge that occupied his mind was ordinary but frustrating. There was still no quick, affordable way to reproduce a patent drawing. Carbon paper left messy marks. Photographic copying was costly, complicated, and time-consuming. Carlson began studying photoconductivity, the idea that certain materials alter their electrical properties when exposed to light. He became convinced that this principle could be used to create a dry copying process. But he had no investors, no laboratory, and no company behind him. All he had was a rented kitchen, an assistant he paid out of pocket, and whatever time he could spare on weekends. The Astoria experiment had succeeded, but the world showed little interest. Carlson secured a patent for electrophotography in 1942 and spent the following years searching for someone willing to develop the technology. He took the idea to more than 20 companies. IBM declined, General Electric declined, RCA declined. Years later, Carlson summed up their reaction with a phrase that captured the irony perfectly: an enthusiastic lack of interest. In 1944, the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, stepped in to help advance the technology. 3 years later, a small Rochester, New York photographic paper company known as the Haloid Company licensed the process. Haloid was a modest operation, bringing in less than $7 million in annual revenue. Its president, Joseph C. Wilson, held an MBA from Harvard and carried an ambitious vision to build a company as powerful as the Kodak empire that had transformed Rochester under his grandfather's watch. Wilson saw the potential that IBM and others had overlooked, and he placed the company's future on it. To give the process a new identity, Haloid turned to a classics professor at Ohio State University who combined the Greek words for dry and writing. The result was the word xerography. The technology finally had a name. Now it needed something even harder, a machine that could actually work. Haloid introduced its first copier, the Model A, in 1949. The machine required 39 separate manual steps just to create one copy. Users quickly gave it a nickname, the Oxbox. It was slow, complicated, and unsuccessful. A decade of development followed, 10 years spent pursuing a fully automated machine that could make copies on ordinary, untreated paper. Throughout that period, Carlson lived a quiet and modest life. His first marriage had ended, and his only steady income came from a small consulting fee. Meanwhile, Wilson continued forward, investing money the company could barely afford to spend on research and development. In August 1959, he sent a letter to his division leaders. "We are about to deliver either our greatest achievement or our greatest disaster." The machine he was referring to carried a price tag of $29,500, a staggering amount that made Wilson realize traditional sales were impossible. Instead, he chose to lease the machines, a decision he would later describe as the most critical move in the company's history. After taking a chance on xerography itself, Wilson was now betting on the business model that would bring it to the world. On September 16, 1959, inside the Sherry Netherland Hotel in New York City, Haloid Xerox unveiled the Xerox 914 in a live television demonstration. During the presentation, one of the two machines on display caught fire. It changed nothing. The 914 had become the world's first fully automatic plain paper copier. The machine weighed 648 pounds and was so large it had to be tilted onto its side just to pass through standard doorways. It required a nationwide network of service technicians and came equipped with a small carbon dioxide fire extinguisher given the company's understated name, the Scorch Eliminator. Operators were even advised not to appear intimidated by the machine because, as one Xerox technician joked, it could somehow sense fear and respond by malfunctioning. None of the machine's flaws slowed demand. Xerox leased the 914 for $95 a month, a price that included 2,000 free copies with an additional charge of 4 cents for each copy beyond that. The average customer produced around 8,000 copies every month. The numbers exploded. Revenue climbed from $32 million in 1959 to nearly $60 million by 1961, surpassed $500 million in 1966, and crossed the $1 billion mark by 1970. Fortune magazine called the 914 the most successful product ever marketed in America when measured by return on investment. More than 200,000 machines were built before production ended in 1976. Today, one of those machines remains preserved at the Smithsonian. The copier transformed Xerox into a powerhouse of American business. But even as the company reached its peak, two developments were already unfolding, developments that would shape everything that came next. Chester Carlson died of a heart attack on September 19, 1968, at the age of 62, while sitting inside a movie theater on West 57th Street in New York City. By that point, he had quietly donated more than $150 million to civil rights groups, affordable housing initiatives, and the United Nations. 1 year before his death, his wife asked him if there was anything he still wished to accomplish. "Only one thing," he replied. "I would like to die a poor man." Joseph Wilson died 3 years later from a heart attack while having lunch with Governor Nelson Rockefeller. The two men responsible for building Xerox were now gone. And thousands of miles away from Rochester, inside a very different kind of laboratory, another invention was already beginning to emerge. In 1970, Xerox chief scientist Jack Goldman established the Palo Alto Research Center in California. He brought in George Paik, a physicist from Washington University, to lead the facility as director. Paik's first major hire was Robert Taylor, the former head of ARPA's Information Processing Techniques Office, who had played a key role in funding some of the most significant computer research of the previous decade. Taylor assembled the team with extraordinary care. Butler Lampson joined from the remains of the failed Berkeley Computer Corporation. Alan Kay came from the University of Utah. Chuck Thacker, Gary Starkweather, Larry Tesler, Robert Metcalf, David Boggs, and Adele Goldberg followed. By the middle of the 1970s, PARC had become home to what colleagues estimated were nearly 50 of the 100 leading computer scientists in America. They were all working together in a building near Stanford, financed by Xerox's copier empire, and granted almost complete freedom to explore whatever ideas they believed could shape the future. Meanwhile, the copier business that funded everything was beginning to collapse. In 1975, the Federal Trade Commission ordered Xerox to license its key patents, opening the door for competitors. Companies like Canon, Ricoh, and Minolta entered the American market with machines that were cheaper, faster, and steadily improving. Xerox's dominance began to disappear. Its share of the U.S. copier market fell from 86% in 1974 to just 17% by 1984. Over that same period, profits plunged from $1.15 billion to $290 million. The copier empire was losing its grip. And inside PARC, On desks far removed from the attention of Rochester executives, engineers had already created the technology that could have transformed the company again. The Xerox Alto, completed in 1973, became the first personal computer designed around a graphical user interface. It featured a mouse, a bitmap display that could show text and graphics together on the same screen, and a visual workspace built from windows, icons, and folders, a desktop concept that would go on to influence nearly every operating system created over the following decades. Roughly 2,000 Altos were produced. They were used within Xerox and placed in a small number of universities, but they were never sold to the public. Gary Starkweather created the laser printer in 1969 while working at Xerox's Webster Research Facility near Rochester. His supervisors wanted him to abandon the project. The copier division could not see the value in a machine that received instructions directly from a computer. Jack Goldman stepped in, moving Starkweather to PARC, where he could continue his work away from corporate interference. Within 9 months, Starkweather had produced the first functioning laser printer. Xerox would not release a commercial version until 1977 with the Xerox 9700. It went on to become a multi-billion-dollar product line and the most financially successful invention to emerge from PARC, a technology the company had nearly eliminated before it ever had a chance to succeed. Robert Metcalf and David Boggs, working at PARC in the mid-1970s, created Ethernet, the networking technology that would eventually link offices, universities, and organizations around the globe. By the middle of the decade, PARC researchers were already using the Alto to send electronic mail, create documents with a WYSIWYG word processor, and print them through a laser printer connected by an Ethernet network. They were not predicting the future. They were already working inside it every day. Xerox executives looked at these breakthroughs and saw costly machines with no clear path toward selling more copiers. In 1981, the company finally brought a commercial version of the Alto's ideas to market with the Xerox Star 8010, a workstation system that could cost as much as $100,000 for a complete office setup. It was too expensive, arrived too late, and targeted the wrong customers. The Star struggled in the marketplace, and slowly, one after another, the researchers who had created the future began to walk away. In December 1979, Steve Jobs visited Xerox PARC. The agreement was simple. Xerox would receive the opportunity to purchase 100,000 shares of Apple stock for $1 million, and in return, PARC would allow Apple engineers access to its research. Adele Goldberg, one of PARC's leading scientists, refused to give the demonstration. She believed Apple would take the ideas and run with them. Xerox management overruled her. An engineer named Larry Tesler showed Jobs the Alto. He moved a cursor with a mouse, opened and closed windows, and interacted with icons on the screen. Jobs left PARC and returned to Apple with a clear demand: build what I just saw. That visit can be interpreted in two different ways, and the truth of the story requires acknowledging both. Apple engineers were already exploring graphical interfaces before the demonstration, and PARC had shown the Alto openly to more than 2,000 outside visitors by 1975. The ideas were not locked away in secrecy, but the visit brought them together, turning a collection of possibilities into a clear vision of what personal computing could become. The Apple Lisa arrived in 1983. The Macintosh followed in 1984. Microsoft Windows came soon after. The people who created these ideas began leaving PARC. Larry Tesler moved to Apple. John Warnock and Chuck Geschke departed to create Adobe. Charles Simonyi went to Microsoft. The engineers who had designed the future walked out of Xerox PARC and into Silicon Valley, not because Xerox lacked the technology, because Xerox never figured out how to turn its own inventions into the products the world wanted. David Kearns, who took over as CEO in 1982, led a focused revival of Xerox's copier business and eventually earned the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award in 1989. But the recovery of the copier division could never replace the opportunity that PARC had created, and that Xerox leadership had chosen not to pursue. Xerox rebuilt its core business, but it never became the computer company its own research lab had already imagined. PARC was separated from Xerox and became an independent subsidiary in 2002. In 2023, Xerox transferred ownership of the research center to SRI International while retaining most of the intellectual property it had created. The numbers tell the rest of the story. In 1998, Xerox carried a market capitalization of roughly $36 billion. By the middle of 2026, that value had fallen to around $400 million, a collapse of more than 99%. The stock trades at only a few dollars per share. A company that once made the word Xerox a synonym for copying can now be valued on paper for less than the price of a single office building in Palo Alto. But the technology survived the company that failed to commercialize it. Every laser printer in use today traces its lineage back to Starkweather's original invention. Every Ethernet connection leads back to the work of Metcalf and Boggs at PARC. Every graphical interface, every icon, every clickable folder on every screen carries the influence of the Alto, Chuck Thacker, Alan Kay, and the engineers who created it inside a laboratory powered by copier profits. 4 PARC researchers have gone on to receive the Turing Award. The Alto remains preserved at the Computer History Museum. The Xerox 914 remains at the Smithsonian. The inventions Xerox allowed to escape are now worth trillions of dollars, powering companies like Apple, Microsoft, Adobe, and countless others that inherited PARC's ideas, even if they rarely acknowledge where those ideas began. In a converted kitchen in Astoria, Queens, in 1938, a patent clerk dragged a handkerchief across a zinc plate and watched 5 faint characters emerge from a cloud of powder. October 22, 38, Astoria. That process, light creating an image on a charged surface, with dry powder bringing the unseen into view, still operates inside every copier and laser printer around the world. Chester Carlson's invention did not fade away. It transformed the world. It simply carried different names because the company that controlled its future could never see itself as anything beyond what it had already become. Xerox did not fail to recognize the future. Xerox created it, displayed it, and proved it was possible. Then it left that future sitting in a building 3,000 miles away from the executives who could have turned it into the next great company. Consider what that means in practical terms. When Steve Jobs took the stage in 1984 to introduce the Macintosh, the graphical interface he presented to the world had already been running on Xerox hardware for over a decade. When Microsoft released Windows 1.0 a year later, the ideas behind it, overlapping windows, pull-down menus, and scroll bars, had already been created, refined, tested, and used every day by PARC engineers who printed their work on laser printers and shared files across Ethernet networks with colleagues just down the hallway. And when John Warnock and Chuck Geschke founded Adobe in 1982, the page description technology behind PostScript was built directly from research they had developed at PARC through the Interpress project. Every one of these billion-dollar companies began with technology that Xerox had already funded, already created, and already proven inside its own laboratories. The irony is not that Xerox failed to innovate. The irony is that Xerox may have been one of the most innovative corporations of the 20th century, and then dismissed its own breakthroughs as distractions. The copier business in Rochester brought in the money. The copier business controlled the strategy. And the copier business looked at the personal computer the way a railroad company might have viewed the airplane. Fascinating, potentially revolutionary, but not our business. Jack Goldman intentionally placed PARC in California, nearly 3,000 miles away from Rochester, to give his researchers the freedom to explore without corporate interference. The separation achieved exactly what he hoped for. The engineers worked without limits, created extraordinary technology, and developed a collection of inventions that could have transformed Xerox into the most dominant company in the history of computing. But that same distance created a divide. The executives controlling the funding rarely visited the lab, rarely interacted with the machines, and never fully grasped what those inventions could become. There is one question that business historians have argued over for decades, and it is worth asking directly. Could Xerox have become Apple? Could it have become Microsoft? The answer, almost certainly, is yes. Not because the technology was ready for everyday consumers in 1975. It was not. The Alto cost around $12,000 to manufacture at a time when the average American automobile sold for roughly $4,000. But Xerox possessed something Apple did not have in 1976 and something Microsoft did not have in 1980. It had resources. The copier business, even while weakening, was still producing hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. It had a worldwide sales and service network that reached nearly every major corporation on Earth. It had a brand name no startup could hope to replicate. And inside a building in Palo Alto, it had the greatest collection of computer talent ever gathered within a single corporate laboratory. What Xerox lacked was not the technology. It lacked the vision to become something different. That is the lesson Xerox leaves behind. And it is not an easy one. Innovation by itself is not enough to win, and opposition to new ideas does not always come from a lack of intelligence. The executives who led Xerox through the 1970s and 1980s were not foolish. They were capable, accomplished managers who had helped transform a company from $7 million in revenue into a corporation generating more than $8 billion in just 2 decades. They understood markets. They understood execution. They understood the copier business down to every service visit and replacement cartridge. What they struggled with was something far more difficult. They could not imagine sacrificing the very business that made them successful in order to build a future that might never arrive. That is the most difficult choice any company faces. And Xerox remains one of the clearest examples in American business history of what happens when that choice is answered with no. Chester Carlson never saw the Alto. He never held a mouse in his hand, never opened a window on a graphical display, and never clicked an icon on a computer screen. He died a decade before his company created the machine that would help shape the future of computing, passing away alone in a movie theater on West 57th Street. By then, he had already donated more than $150 million to causes he believed in. There was nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove. Joseph Wilson never saw PARC reach its greatest achievements. He died in 1971, only a year after the laboratory opened, still convinced that Xerox had the potential to become the company of the future. Both men understood something that the executives who came after them failed to grasp. A company's purpose is not simply to defend what already made it successful. It is to transform itself into something it has not yet imagined. Carlson pursued dry copying when experts insisted it could not be done. Wilson risked a $7 million company on a technology that had spent a decade being rejected. They were willing to take the chance. The generation that followed was not. If you worked at PARC, at the Rochester facilities, or with any Xerox machine from the 914 to the Star, leave a comment below. Tell us the model, the year, and whether it still works today. The engineers who created these systems, and the people who used them firsthand, understand what was lost far better than the executives who allowed them to slip away. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring these stories, because this channel is building an archive of the companies and inventions that shaped the electronic world. Another American technology empire is coming next, and the way that story ends is one you will not want to miss.